we are absolutely delighted to have with us an eminent researcher who's been a friend of Center for Global Finance for many years, and her co-author, but also very interesting is the topic and issue explored in the seminar, the gender gap in financial constraints. Do political connections matter? Absolutely new work, new insights. And we should be able, as work in progress, we should try to make important observations in the paper. Constructive comments welcome. And also we have a case of looking into further questions and discussion, maybe at the end of the presentation. I know that Alessandra is very well known to many people here in the audience, but it is always expected that even when the speaker is very well known, as Alessandra is, we should have the pleasure of introducing her formally. So Alessandra is as I said, an old friend of the Center for Global Finance, and is currently a professor of financial economics at the Birmingham Business School at the University of Birmingham. And she has worked in many research fields, mainly in the corporate finance area, corporate governance, and also the financial economics and economics of transition in China, in which she has led many research projects in that particular area. She's also a prolific researcher, prolific publisher, having hit some of the top journals in our field, Journal of Corporate Finance, Review of Finance, the British Journal of Management, Journal of Banking and Finance, Journal of International Economics. I could go on and on and on about the journals that have actually served as outlets for her work. But Alessandra is also very busy in editing high-profile journals. She is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Climate Finance, co-editor of the Scottish Journal of Political Economy, and the Journal of Chinese Economic and Business Studies, and also associate editor of the European Journal of Finance, that a couple of years ago was based at the University of at SOAS University, SOAS University of London, and also a associate editor of the British Accounting Review. She has also been active in the management field. Was head of the Department of Economics at Birmingham from 2012 to 2015, and the head of the Departments of Economics and Accounting and Finance that is two departments, Department of Economics and then Department of Accounting and Finance at the University of Durham between 2009 and 2012. She has also worked at various universities in the UK, the University of Nottingham, University of Kent, and Essex University. She has also contributed to external examinership globally, having been an external examiner at the University of Mauritius for a couple of years. So Alessandra, we are very much delighted to have you here. And Alessandra appears today with a co-author, a very active young researcher, who indeed, as you can see from this work, is already researching some very important issues, and is at the moment working closely with Alessandra at the University of Birmingham, and that is Dongqing Liang. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Forgive me if I got it wrong. Okay, so Alessandra, as usual, we are very excited. I should add actually very quickly that as from the SIP, she was here a couple of years back, maybe 2019, before the lockdown, presenting a very interesting paper that was eventually published in a top-tier journal, the Journal of Corporate Finance. This will be the same, we predict. So, Alessandra, with pleasure, you are welcome to start presenting your paper. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor, for your kind words. I mean, that's a very nice introduction, and I indeed remember that seminar in 2019. Not only because the paper was then published, but that was kind of when you gave me my introduction to the AERC. And
Yes.
after that, I started attending all the meetings of the African Economic Research Consortium and being a resource person over there, which has been very enjoyable for me. So it's like a long story behind the seminar in 2019. So yeah. But today it's a different seminar because it's an online seminar, but still I think it's going to be quite a nice experience for everybody. And so yeah, the title of our paper is "The Gender Gap in Financial Constraints, Do Political Connections Matter?" And I'll start with an introduction, and then I will talk about our contribution in this paper, and then mention our data and methods, and then some results, and then some conclusions. So as a matter of background, it has been found that firms that have female executives, and that can be a female CEO, a female CFO, or some directors in the board of directors that are females, so this kind of female executives, it has been found that firms that have this kind of female executives, generally they perform better and they're less overconfident than firms which have like male executives. So in a sense, it was found that having a female executive was beneficial for the firm. And as a result of this finding, many countries made some laws in order to encourage more gender diversity, both in the board of directors and in the company's C-suites. And they have done this through some legislations. So, for example, in Italy, there was the Golfo Mosca law, which said that in the board of directors, a certain percentage of the members had to be females. And then, like more recently, I think in France and Germany, they established some laws that said that a given number of people in the C-suites had to be females. So they realized that having female executive was beneficial for the firms. And many countries established these laws in order to make sure that this diversity is indeed there in the country's companies. However, the literature has not really investigated whether firms with female executives are more or less financially constrained compared to firms with male executives. That has not really been investigated very widely. And especially in the context of developing countries, it has not been investigated at all. And also, if there is such a gender gap in financial constraints, the literature has not really looked at whether this problem is due to a gender bias. I mean, maybe there are not enough females because it's hard for females to get into these positions, or something due to gender bias, or whether the gender gap in financial constraints may be due to some other factor like political connections, which can explain it. And this has not been very widely investigated. So the question is now, why did previous studies not really look at gender gaps in financial constraints? So there is one paper on China by Sun and Zhu that shows that in China there is a CEO gap in profitability. So firms with female CEOs perform better than firms with male CEOs, and they have explained that this CEO gender gap in the profitability derives from political connections. But these same authors have also looked at whether there is any gender gap in the financial constraints, and they found that no, there is no gender gap in financial constraints in China. So firms with male or female CEO, in terms of financial constraints, they are basically the same. But then they said, yeah, why is that? Well, basically, they said this happens because listed firms in China actually they don't have financial constraints. They're big firms and they don't have financial constraints. So independently on whether your CEO is a male or female, there is no gap, no financial constraint in China. So no gap, of course. But then this contradicts some literatures, because other papers like Lin and Bo 2012 and Meng and co-authors 2020, they found that indeed, using same listed companies, they found that indeed there is financial constraint. They didn't look at gender gap, but they found that there is financial constraints. So the conclusion by Sun and Zhu that there is no financial constraint among listed firms in China contradicts the literature. And then it's strange because they all these papers, Sun and Zhu and Lin and Bo and Meng et al., they use the listed firms in China. So it's the same data. And some guys say there is no financial constraint, and other guys say, but there is financial constraint. Why is that? Well, they measure financial constraints in a different way. So possibly one or the other, they don't measure financial constraints in the right way, and hence maybe they conclude that there is no financial constraint because they measure it in a way which is maybe not appropriate. That's a possibility. So this is what happens. Now, these authors that I just mentioned and ourselves also, we focus on China. And you could ask, why do we want to focus on China? Well, I mean, financial constraints in general have been found to be pretty severe in developing countries. Why is that? Well, because typically some developing countries have less developed institutions and less developed legal systems. And so as a result of this, especially in a country like China, financial constraints are quite widespread. Okay. And then another reason why we would like to focus on China, because our paper also looks at the role of political connections. In China, political connections play a very important role. And not only that, but the female executives in China have been found to have stronger political connections than their male counterparts. So there are some studies like Fan and co-authors 27, they indeed showed that firms with female executives have much stronger financial constraints compared to firms with male executives. And as a result, if you have strong financial constraints, if you have strong political connections in China, that makes it easier for you to access finance. So in China, there are, like, the financial system is not very developed. Banks are mainly state-owned, and it's very difficult for firms to get loans from the banks. But if a firm has political connection, maybe it's kind of has a relationship, political relationship with some provincial government, for example, then this provincial government makes it easier for the firm to get the loan from the banks. So having a political connection makes it easier for these firms in China to access finance in general. So in the context of China, financial constraints are widespread. Political connections also play a very important role, especially for females, and political connections may ease financial constraints as well in China in particular. And then the last reason why we would like to focus on China is that we benefit from a so-called very interesting natural experiment in the Chinese context. And that experiment is the anti-corruption campaign. We call that here after ACC, anti-corruption campaign. And that took place over the period 2012-2016. I'm going to describe what that was in a lot of detail in a second. But the ACC basically led to the arrest of many corrupted officials. And as a result, the political connections were in many cases destroyed. So that is an important natural experiment. Political connections were very prevalent before 2012, but after 2012, because of the anti-corruption campaign, there was a destruction of many political connections. So let's explain why. What is the ACC? So it was launched in November 2012 by the Chinese government, and it has been labeled as the most intense anti-corruption campaign in modern China. So there's a paper by Kong and Chin, and they say that by 2012, the campaign netted 174 big tigers. And what are these? 5 national leaders, several top state-owned enterprise executives, and about a dozen high-ranking military officials. So again, it hit many big guys. But not only that, many other officials at all levels were arrested throughout the campaign between 2012 and 2016. So if somebody was deemed to be a corrupt official, whatever the level, not only the big guys, but also like smaller level, lower level political officials, they were arrested. And very important paper by Giannetti and co-authors, they say that the anti-corruption campaign has increased the expected punishment associated with corruption, and as a result has decreased the officials' willingness to be corrupted. So if you were found to be corrupted, the punishment was severe, you could be arrested, and so as a result, before starting some potentially corrupt activities, you think twice and you don't want to risk it. And so corruption was really kind of lowered quite a lot as a result of this campaign. It was quite successful. Many papers looked at the effects of this campaign on many aspects of firm behavior, like financial behaviors, mergers and acquisitions, and there is a lot of papers that looked at various effects of this AC&C on various dimensions of corporate activities. But the interesting thing about this AC&C is that it was a completely exogenous factor. It was completely external to the firms. If some officials were arrested, that had nothing to do with the firm, had nothing to do with the performance of the province where they were based or the performance of the city where they were based. It was just external to everything. And it was a purely political campaign which was undertaken in China. So it can be considered as exogenous. It's not related to the firm, has nothing to do with the firm. It's exogenous, completely exogenous. Okay. And different provinces were affected in different degrees by the AC&C. So here you have all the Chinese provinces, and these rectangles, they are higher if you have like a higher number of corrupted officials arrested as a result of the AC&C. So some provinces, like the ones on the left, had a lot of officials arrested, but some provinces had very few. And that, again, is a political factor. This is not an endogenous thing. It depends just on political considerations. But it was quite diverse. So some provinces were affected a lot, and some provinces were affected much less. And then also it started in 2012. It was kicked in. The ACC was kicked in 2012, but the effects were lagged. So they were like, in general, 1 or 2 years lagged. So in 2013, about 1,500 officials were arrested. And then in 2014, 6,000 were arrested. And then in 2015, 9,000 were arrested. And then a few more in 2016. So the major effects of this anti-corruption campaign happened with a couple of years lags here. So the trend is kind of diverse across years. Okay, so that is for the AC&C, and I'm going to explain later how we use it and what role it plays in our identification strategy. But now I would like to talk a bit about some literature and what we add to some literature. So there is some literature that looked at the effects of gender on financial constraints. And the relationship is ambiguous. For example, if we want to focus on developed countries, there are some papers that looked at some very small micro enterprises. These are Cavalluzzo and co-authors and Alessandra and co-authors. And they find that female-owned companies find always more difficult to get bank loans compared to the male-owned enterprises. And these authors found that this was due to gender discrimination. So the banks, if they see a company which is owned by a female and the company asks for a loan, the bank says, well, maybe it's not reliable, let's not lend money to this company. And so they found a gender discrimination in developed countries. But some other authors, like Francis and Siedo and co-authors, they find the opposite. They say females are more risk averse than males. And so a company which is owned or managed by a female is kind of seen as more attractive by the bank. The bank will want to lend more to a company managed or owned by a female because the females are less risk averse. So if they use the money to invest, the investments are going to be less risky and more wise. And so the bank will prefer to lend money to companies that are managed or owned by females. So for developing countries, there are like opposite findings between these two sets of authors. And then for developing countries, there is a paper by Murinde and co-authors, and they showed that companies managed by females, they have to pay higher interest rates on their loans. But then they found that this gap is kind of changes according to the level of financial development of the countries, So the females have to pay higher interest rate in general, but it's not as high if the country where they're based has high financial development. So if the company is based in a highly financially developed country, then females may have to pay a little bit higher interest rate, but not actually high interest rate. And so this advantage of male managed firms is not as big in countries with high financial development. And then for China, some other authors like Usman and Luo and co-authors, they find that firms with female CEOs generally have to pay less for external finance. So this is what they find. Okay. And now what about political connection? If we want to look at gender, financial constraints, and political connection, what has the literature found? Well, in general, the literature has found that the politically connected firms in general find it easier to obtain financing. So for developed countries, literature has found that if a firm is politically connected, it's easier for this firm to get bank loans, basically. And other authors have found that this is the same in developing countries, whereby, for example, politically connected companies can get loans for a longer time in Vietnam. And so several papers have looked at the beneficial effects of political connection in obtaining loans from the banks. But there is an issue. So if political connected firms can get loans more easily, but their performance is not very good. So even though they find it easier to get loans from banks, typically they perform worse than firms without connections. So political connections is quite interesting in a sense. I mean, it's yeah, if you're politically connected, maybe you got the right connections that enable you to get cheaper loans, but your performance is not necessarily better. And so, having said this and having contextualized our work within the literature, let me explain what we're going to do in this paper. So first of all, we are going to look at two different measures of financial constraints. Because remember, in previous literature, some authors found that listed companies in China have no financial constraints, but other authors using same data found that they have financial constraints. So how we measure financial constraints explain the difference in finding in these literatures. So we are going to provide two measures of financial constraints. I'm going to discuss them in detail later. But the first one is basically kind of can be seen as a measure of financial constraints as perceived by the company's CFO, the chief financial officer. And the second one is going to be a completely different measure of financial constraints, which we claim is going to be the financial constraints as perceived by the firm's CEO. So one measure is perceived by CFO, and one measure is as perceived by CEO. CFO and CEO are two key managers in the firm, and we're going to show that the way they perceive financial constraints can have interesting results. And I'm going to explain how these are calculated later. I'm not going to do that now. So now all I'm going to say is that we're going to propose two interesting and diverse measures of financial constraints. And then using these measures and panel of listed Chinese companies, we focus on period 2011-2020, and we want to investigate whether there is a gender gap in financial constraints. So whether, according to whether the CEO, CFO of the company are male or female, we're going to look at whether financial constraints are like more or less strong. And so is there a gender gap in financial constraints based on these two measures that I'm going to define in a second? And then we are going to try and understand whether the gender gap in financial constraints, which we are going to find, whether it is related to political connections. So is it possible that there was a gender gap in financial constraints and that this was due to political connections? And how are we going to look at that? Well, we're going to exploit this anti-corruption campaign as an exogenous shock that destroyed political connections. So before ACNC, there were a lot of political connections, but this disappeared after the campaign. So if we find a gender gap in financial constraint before the campaign, but not after, it is possible that we could claim that the gender gap was due to political connection. That's what we're going to claim. And so how we do this, we examine whether this gender gap in financial constraint changed before and after the shock, which is the ACNC. So that is what we do. So we have three basic contributions: the measures of financial constraints, which are different, and then look at, is there a gender gap in financial constraints, yes or no? And then we're going to find that the answer is yes. And then, is this gender gap related to financial constraints, yes or no? Oops, sorry for this. Yeah. And then we're going to try and understand whether this gender gap is due to the financial constraint, to the political connections, yes or no. So this is what we do. So this is our research questions. And now I would like to talk about our contributions in general. Okay, so we have a few contributions, and the first, we would like to disentangle the relationship between gender gap and financial constraints and political connections. So to the best of our knowledge, nobody else has analyzed the role of political connection in explaining any gender gap in financial constraints. So it has not been done in the literature. So this kind of study is novel. And we focus on the Chinese case because that we can exploit this anti-corruption campaign as a natural experiment. Before the ACNC, there were a lot of political connections. They played a big role. After the ACNC, the political connections were just kind of destroyed as a result of the ACNC. And so this ACNC is very important. It plays a key role in our identification strategy because, as I said, it went hand in hand with a destruction of political connections. And so we're going to use the difference in difference analysis in our empirical estimations using the ACNC as the exogenous shock. And we look at what happens before and after. I'm going to explain how that is done in a moment. So we look at whether there is gender gap in financial constraints and whether the political connections can explain it. And then the second contribution, we devised two measures of financial constraints, one perceived by the CEO and one perceived by the CFO. So the chief executive officer, the CEO, is in general responsible for giving the firm's development direction and performance, so like the strategy of the firm, where the firm wants to go, what does it want to invest in, which countries does it want to expand, if it's a multinational, whatever. So the CEO is responsible for the broad strategy of the company, a bit like the vice chancellor for the university, the broad strategy. And the chief financial officer is kind of more looking more closely at specific accounting and financial decisions of the firm. So deciding, for example, financial leverage, cash holdings, capital structure, bank loans, and stuff like that. So CEO has the broader perspective, is responsible for the broader direction of where the firm is going, and CFO looks at specific policies like financial leverage, cash holdings, bank loans, and so on. And the two of them, CEO and CFO, can have inconsistent opinions. And again, to the best of our knowledge, nobody has tried to differentiate financial constraints into those perceived by one and those perceived by the other. So we're the first to differentiate financial constraints as perceived by CEO and financial constraints as perceived by CFO. Again, I'm going to explain that in detail later. And so also, our measure of financial constraints as perceived by the CEO is a fairly innovative measure because it's based on text-based analysis. And we're going to use data taken from the management decision and analysis section of the firm's annual report. So that's a section where they write how the firm has performed, where the firm is going, what are the firm's goals, whether it has met the goals from last year, and things like that. So the management decision and analysis section of the firm's annual report has a lot of words, and we're going to use that to construct a very new text-based index of financial constraint. We're going to follow some literature that has done something similar in other countries. We're going to use a kind of random forest model and derive a score. And we're going to show that using this random forest model, the results are better than if we use traditional models like Bayesian model used in the literature. So we used a new method to do this. And other papers in other countries had indeed looked at text-based measures of financial constraints, but nobody has done this for China. And the Chinese language is very different from English, and so there are like a lot of different tones in the Chinese language. So deriving text-based measures of whatever is quite hard in Chinese, and we do this, so that contributes to the literature on text-based measures of financial constraints as well. And then I'm going to explain, like broadly speaking, how this index is constructed, and then later on. But this measure of financial constraints obtained from the text-based analysis derived using the text in the management decision and analysis section of firm's annual report. Because that section is written by the CEO, we claim that this index is index perceived by the CEO. And so that is our contribution number 3. Okay, so what hypothesis do we test? So the first hypothesis is we look at gender gap in financial constraints. And gender gap, we want to look at whether financial constraints are different according to whether the CEO is male or female. And then we're also looking at whether the CFO is male or female, and whether a firm with a male or female CEO or CFO has higher or lower level of financial constraints. And so our first hypothesis is that the CEO gender gap in financial constraints, so financial constraints being lower if the CEO is female, that we claim that can only be seen when we use the text-based index of financial constraints. And then the CFO gender gap in financial constraints, whether financial constraints are lower if the CFO is female compared to males, that will only be apparent when we use our second measure of financial constraints, the KZ index, which is the one as perceived by the CFO. So according to how we measure financial constraints, we are going to kind of identify one type of gender gap in financial constraints or the other. And we're going to see some graphs about that, which is going to clarify the issue. But the main idea here is that whether there is gender gap in financial constraints based on CEO and CFO gender depends on how you measure the financial constraint. Okay, and so why do we think that? Well, we think that when we focus on issues surrounding corporate finance, so some indexes like leverage ratio, cash ratio, and things like that, that is something which is more relevant to the CFO. Okay, and for example, some article by Chopol and co-authors, they find a gender gap in leverage ratio only significant for CFO. So if the firm is led by a female CFO, they find leverage ratio is higher, but this is not relevant at all for CEO. And so these authors, they look at US, I think, and they find that according to whether you look at gender of CFO or CEO, you find a gender gap in leverage ratio, yes or no? And the answer is you only find this gender gap in leverage ratio if you focus on gender of CFO, who is responsible for the leverage ratio. And so we kind of build on their analysis to justify our hypothesis. And again, the KZ index, I'll explain exactly what it is in a moment, but that is controlled by the CFO. And our text-based index, because it is based on this management decision and analysis section, which is written by the CEO, that index based on the MD&A section is going to be a measure of financial constraints as perceived by the CEO. So that is our hypothesis, our first hypothesis. And then the second hypothesis, we claim that firms guided by female executive were less financially constrained than firms guided by male, CFO, CEO. They were less financially constrained before the ACNC. So before the anti-corruption campaign, firms managed by females, CFO or CEO, were less financially constrained. So there was a gender gap in financial constraint favoring the female executive. But this advantage vanished completely after the ACNC. So after the political connections were destructed, there was a much lower or no advantage at all of females-led companies in terms of financial constraints compared to companies led by males. So there was a gender gap in financial constraints favoring female managed companies only before the ACNC. After the ACNC, that advantage of females disappeared. So it looks as though the political connections, which were very prevalent before the ACNC, did play a role, because after the political connection died as a result of the ACNC, this advantage just disappeared. So this suggests, we hypothesize that the gender gap in financial constraints observed before the campaign was due to the political connection. After the political connections were destroyed, the advantage disappeared as well. Okay, and indeed, this literature by Fan and Quarters and Sun and Zhou, they did find that female executives in China were more political connected than males. And then other literatures found that if you're politically connected, you can easily get external funds. Okay, and so for these reasons, we claim that before the ACNC, female-led companies were financially at an advantage because they had political connections, but after the political connections were destroyed, the advantage just disappeared. So that is our second hypothesis that we're going to test. Okay, so what data do we use to test this hypothesis? We have a lot of data sources here. So the main data source is the CSMAR database for listed companies, which we start looking at 2011 as the first year, because before that, there was a change in the Chinese accounting standards. So between 2007 and 2010, accounting standards changed. So some of the variables are not comparable before and after. So we start in 2011 after this reform had been made, and we finish in 2020. So this data set, the CSMAR data set, contains all the Chinese listed companies. And just to give you a flavor of this, only about 7%, 6.5% have female CEO, but many more have female CFO, 33% have female CFO. So that is data that is freely available. No, we have to pay actually to get this data set, but it's free for our university. But it's widely used data set on Chinese listed companies. And then we find also data about the firm's management decision and analysis section, which is like text section. So we have to web crawl the annual reports on the website of the company's the stock exchange to get this D&A section. And then we collect this section from the annual reports. And then to identify political connections, we also use the CV, the resumes of the CEO and the CFO. And we claim that if they ever worked in the government, they have some political connection. And we also claim that if they are party members, they also have political connection. So we define political connection of CEO or CFO based on whether they ever worked for some government, provincial or national or whatever, and whether they are party members. But we only use this measure for political connections in the descriptive statistics. We don't use that in the core of our analysis. So that's just for descriptive statistics. So it's not very important. And because this measure of political connection can be criticized, but again, we only use it for descriptive purposes. And then the final data source that we have is the China's corrupt investigations data set, which says province by province when the campaign actually started and things like that. So we have basically like several data sources, but our main sample is made up by about 23,000 firm year observations. So it's quite large data set. And now let me talk about these famous measures of financial constraints. Okay, so we have the first one. That is the Kaplan and Zingales index. So Kaplan and Zingales were US economists. And back in the 90s, they devised a financial constraint index for US companies. And that index is a function of cash flow, dividend payments, leverage ratio, and Tobin's Q. And then they make an index that was widely used in many literatures across the world. So that index, using the coefficients obtained from the US companies, was used throughout the world. And the higher the index, the more financially constrained the firm are. And the coefficients were obtained from a regression analysis based on the US firms. Although this index was widely used, it is based on the regression coefficients for US listed companies, but we look at China. So using that index maybe is not very reliable for China. It has been used for China. Some of the literatures I highlighted at the very beginning of the presentation used the coefficients taken from the US also for China. It has been done many times, and the papers have been published. But we think China is too different from the US, so we don't like to use the traditional KZ index using US-based regression coefficients. So we employ the adjusted KZ index, which was proposed by Tan and Jia, and that is an index which is based on Chinese listed companies from the CISMAR data set, and so we believe it's more reliable. So the index is calculated using the formula below. So we take the cash of the firms in our sample, the cash flow of the firms in our sample, the dividend of the firms in our sample, the leverage of Tobin skew. We have that data for the firms in our sample, and we multiply by these coefficients, which were obtained by these authors based on the same companies that we have. So we believe that this index is kind of nice for China, applicable for China, and it's better than using the numbers here, regression coefficients from US. And so this is not a big contribution to using this index, because I mean it was used before by these authors here, Tan and Jia. But we like this index because it's based on these ratios: cash flow ratio, dividend payout ratio, leverage ratio, which are typically controlled by the CFO. So we believe that this index can be seen as the financial constraint index as perceived by the CFO, because it is based on indexes which are typically controlled by the CFO. So this is our KZ index, which measures financial constraints as perceived by the chief financial officer. And then what about the next one? The next one is a bit more complicated. So I'm just going to give you the highlights here. We can discuss later if you're interested. So we use the words included in the MD&A section of the annual reports of the companies. And in this section, for some companies, it clearly states in words whether the company is financially constrained or not financially constrained. So for some companies, we know for sure that they're financially constrained or financially healthy, because it is stated explicitly in that statement in words that they're financially constrained or financially healthy. So we know for sure that some companies are constrained and some are healthy. So we create a small homogeneous training sample in which we can classify for sure these firms are financially constrained and these other firms are not financially constrained for sure. And then we find some words that are related to the financial constraints. So, for example, having to forego some investment, or having insufficient liquidity, not having enough bank loans, or things like that. So we find some words or phrases which connect to financial constraints. So insufficient liquidity, not enough cash, give up investment. This type of phrases typically show that you have a financial constraint. And then using this training sample, we know for sure that these firms are financially constrained. And we find these words, and we make a function, we estimate a function of being financially constrained, which we know for sure, as a function of these words. And there is a series of words. And we make a model, and the little f is the random forest model. And we obtain a mapping between these words and the probability of being financially constrained. And then we can obtain somehow a text classification score that indicates the probability that a given firm is financially constrained. So we know that these words, 1, 2, and 3, are associated with financial constraint, and we know the functional form, because in the training sample, we know for sure who is financially constrained and who is not. Then, this is a small training sample, then we extrapolate this function f to the bigger sample, where we're not sure whether this firm is constrained or not. But we know F and we know the words because we find these words: insufficient liquidity, give up investment, and whatever. We find these words in the annual report of many companies. So we have these words, we have the F function, we can use the random forest model, and for firms that are outside the training sample, we extrapolate the function, and then we can get a random forest RFM score for whether the firm is financially constrained or not. So we start with a small training sample, we identify the words associated with financial constraints and the function that maps the words to the financial constraints, do that in the training sample, then that same function and same words we find in the broader sample, and we don't know in the broader sample who is financially constrained and who is not, but we apply the function to the words and we get the index for financial constraint. And this is the RFM index, and the higher the index, the more likely the firm is going to be financially constrained. Now, because this analysis, which is quite complicated, because it relates to the MD&A section of the firm's annual report, and because this section is written by the CEO, we claim that this RFM score is a good indicator of financial constraint as perceived by the company's CEO. Okay, so we get these measures. But then you can ask, I mean, the higher KZ index, the higher RFM score, the more financially constrained the firm is. But do these indices make sense? Are they reliable, or are they complete rubbish? Well, we make some tests. So we want to look at whether, financially constrained firms, based on having high KZ or RFM score, whether they show kind of different levels of Tobin skew, investment, profitability, cash, or whatever. And here we made this test. So in panel A, we look at how RFM score relates to Tobin Q, investment, return on asset, dividend, cash, and sales growth. And in panel B, we do the same for the KZ index. We want to show how it relates to all these variables. And now, if we focus on Tobin skew is like a measure of the firm's financial investment opportunities, market value of the firm over the book value of its capital stock. So if a firm, the Tobin skew is a measure of investment opportunities. Now, if a firm is financially constrained, it would like to invest a lot, but cannot invest because it doesn't have the money. The bank won't lend it money. So a financially constrained firm is expected to have high Tobin Q because they would like to invest a lot, but they can't. So they have a lot of investment opportunities, but they don't invest because they don't have the money. So opportunities are high, but they don't invest. So Tobin skew is a measure of investment opportunities. And for both RFM score and KZ index, we find positive coefficient. This means the higher the score, the higher the financial constraint score, whatever the measure that we use, the higher Tobin skew. So more financially constrained you are, the more you have investment opportunity. That makes sense. That's what we would expect. But if we are financially constrained, the more financially constrained we are, the less we can invest because we don't have the money to invest. So investment is negative. You can see column 2 of both panels. Higher RFM or KZ score, lower investment because we are constrained. We don't have money. We can't invest. Investment gets lower. And then also we are constrained. We can't invest. We have profitable investment projects that we have to give up. So our profitability is going to be relatively low because we can't invest in the profitable project because we don't have money. So look at column 3, negative. Again, the more financially constrained we are, the less we can invest and the lower our profitability because we give up the profitable projects. And cash is negative because we don't have enough cash. So if you look at these indices, I mean, you get what you would expect. More constrained firms, they have a lot of investment opportunities because they just cannot invest. So they have a lot of opportunities. And also, the more financially constrained I am, the less I can invest and the lower my profitability. That all makes sense. So this suggests that basically our two measures of financial constraint, they are sensible. They do make some sense. They seem quite reliable. Okay, so now let's move on to what are we going to estimate in this paper. So we are going to estimate basically a difference model, and we are going to look at financial constraint index on the left-hand side. So FinCon is the degree of financial constraint, which can be either the RFM score or the KZ score. And then we want to look at female, which is an indicator, which is one if you have a female CEO or CFO and zero otherwise. And then post is after the ACNC, is one if it's after the ACNC and before zero if it's before the ACNC. And then we have a lot of control variables like profitability, size, age of the firm, and whatever, and then some error terms. So what is this doing? We want to look at whether having female CEO or CFO is associated with lower financial constraints. If that's the case, a female CFO or CEO has lower financial constraints, that indicates a gender gap in financial constraints in favor of the female. And then we want to see whether that's due to political connection. If that is due to political connection, we would expect there to be a gender gap in financial constraint. So female companies, female managed companies having lower financial constraint, but we would expect this to be lower after the ACNC, so post-reform. So basically, we would expect female but then we would expect this gender gap to shrink post-ACNC. And so we would expect beta 2 to be negative, but beta 1 to be positive, because after political connections are destroyed as a result of the ACNC, if females had an advantage in financial constraints before the ACNC due to political connection, that advantage will disappear after the connections disappear as a result of the ACNC. So this framework is a DID framework, quite elegant. We can test very easily what we want to test for. And if we find what I just said, then our hypothesis will hold. So it's quite interesting. Now, what is the timing of the ACNC? The timing of the ACNC changed quite a bit according to the companies. So some companies, according to where the company is based. So in some provinces, the ACNC started in 2013, and in some provinces it started in 2014. Like I'm talking here about the real effect. The ACNC started in 2012, but actual arrest of officials and things started later on. And this data, where does it come from? It comes from the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. And so these data are taken from the CCDI. So you can see that ACNC, so the post in the equation before, in the slide before, the post is different according to which province the company is based in. It can be either 2013 or 2014, and the dates are here. So we need to use different post dates for different companies based on which province they are resident in. Okay, so that is the plan of what we are doing. Now, what about some results? Okay, this is just descriptive statistics. This just is nothing to do with the regression, but I think it's quite illuminating. Okay, we have 4 panels in this graph. And we look at whether the CEO is politically connected. These are the top 2 graphs. And then the CFO are depicted in the last 2 graphs. We have 2 measures of political connection. On the left 2 panels, political experience, whether CEO or CFO worked in the government or provincial government or whatever government. And then on the right-hand side, the 2 panels on the right-hand side is whether the CEO or a CFO is a party member. And then we have like the political percentage, so percentage of officials with either political experience or party membership. We have that before and after the ACNC. And then the blue is the male CEO or CFO, and the pink is for the female. So for example, if you look at the CEO, the top 2 panels, you can see that before the ACNC, females have higher political connection compared to males. This is male, this is female. Pink is taller. And then here for party membership, female party members is much more than male party members. So before AC&C, you can see a huge advantage of females in terms of political experience and in terms of party membership. Now, in terms of CFO, here it's a bit less evident, but here you can see male party membership very low before the AC&C, female party member very high. So you can see a big political advantage of the females before the AC&C in 3 cases out of 4. That's quite significant. After the AC&C, all the rectangles become much lower. So this means political connections become lower for some reason. And you can see after the AC&C, the difference between the male and female histograms, the difference in height is much smaller. So both blue and green become smaller, and the difference is much smaller. Here it was huge. Here it's still there, but it's smaller. Here it was huge, but here it's still there, but it's smaller. So before AC&C, female executives were more likely to have stronger connections. After AC&C, female executives suffer from more severe destruction of the political connection compared with the males, and the gender gap becomes smaller. Gender gap is very high here, huge here, but here it's very small, here it's very small. So that's just descriptive statistics, and we don't use that thereafter. But I think it's quite interesting to see, because you see these huge differences in gender gap before and after political connections. Okay, let's now move on to the serious stuff, which is the regression analysis. So I mentioned before what model we are estimating, so the difference in difference model. Before we estimate that model, we need to test for the parallel trends. So how do we test for the parallel trends? Well, we look at female dummy again, and then we look at female dummy and we look at how it differentiates, how it behaves 2 years before the AC&C, 1 year before the AC&C, at the moment of the AC&C, after this AC&C, 1 year after, 2 years after, and 3 years after. So we have this dynamic model in which we show how the female advantage in terms of financial constraints, how it behaves many years before the AC&C and many years after the AC&C. Okay, so we want to look at this. And we want to show that before the AC&C, there was a significant gender gap in financial constraints, but then the AC&C happens and the gender gap disappears. So we expect these coefficients to be statistically significant because there was a gender gap before AC&C, but after the AC&C, we expect these coefficients not to be significant because after political connections are lost, the gender gap is lost as well. So is that what we find? Yes or no? Okay, so here we have the results. So again, we focus on several measures of the financial constraints. So here it's the random forest score model, and then here is the random score model, and here is CEO and here is CFO. KZ index is here and here on the right-hand side. Top is CEO, bottom is CFO. So we claim that for financial constraints, the random forest model score is relevant for the CEO. So let's look at this. So here is before the AC&C, 3 to 1 year before the AC&C, and this is after the AC&C. And this picture denotes the financial constraint, the difference between the female and male executive in terms of financial constraints. So what can we see? Here we see a considerable and significant effect before the AC&C, but after the AC&C, it's not significant. You can see this. These are not significant, these coefficients. So the female CEO from this graph A, the female CEO have a significant lower random forest score, financial constraint score is significantly lower than the males, okay? Lower than the males before the AC&C, but then after the AC&C, the gender gap disappears. These are not significant. These coefficients are not significant. So female CEO have significantly lower score than males before the reform, but not after the reform. Okay. If you look at RFM score for CFO, nothing is significant. It's a mess here. Why? Well, because the RFM score for CFO is irrelevant. CFO doesn't bother with the RFM score, which is dependent on the MD&A text, which is written by the CEO. So the CFO does not seem affected by the RFM financial constraint score, because the RFM financial constraint score is based on the M&D analysis, which is not written by the CFO. So no significant effect here. Now let's focus on the KZ index. Now, focus on this panel. We claim that the KZ index is controlled by the CFO. So the higher the KZ index, that indicates higher financial constraints as perceived by the CFO. So KZ index is relevant for CFO. And we can see that average KZ index of female CFO is lower before the AC&C. Here it's lower compared to males. And then if you move after the reform, slowly, the difference becomes insignificant. Okay, it is significant at the beginning, but it becomes insignificant later. So the average KZ index of female CFO is much lower before the reform, but after the reform, after a couple of years, the difference becomes insignificant. Okay. And so the KZ index basically needs time to adjust because it's based on accounting indexes, and this take time to adjust. They don't adjust in 2 minutes. So that's why there is a delay here. And then if you look for KZ index and focus on gender gap for CEO, it's all over the place. It's not significant. So nothing matters here. So the key results are this one, panel A and panel D. So for panel A, we focus on random forest model score. We can see that before the reform, females have gender gap, advantage in financial constraint. Disadvantage disappeared after the reform. Focusing on CFO gender gap, relevant index is KZ index. Gender gap is in favor of females before the reform, and then after a couple of years, gender gap disappears after the reform. So before reform, there is a gender advantage in terms of financial constraint. After the reform, gender gap disappears. This suggests that indeed the gender gap before the reform was due to the political connections. Okay, so that is the result that we find. That is just for the parallel trends assumption hypothesis, but now we would like to move to the more serious stuff. So do we find indeed a gender gap in financial constraints before the AC&C, and does this gender gap disappear after the reform? Well, the answer is yes. So here are our results. So here we focus on the text-based RFM score, and here is the KZ score. Here we have female, and here we have female times post. So these are the two coefficients I want to focus on. This is the coefficient on female. If it's negative, it tells us that the score is lower for females. And then, for example, if we look at our CEO, if the female is CEO, if the CEO is female, before the reform, we have a negative coefficient. So that means that before the reform, basically, the financial constraint score is lower for female. This means that before the reform, there is a gender gap in financial constraints in favor of the female. However, after the reform, it becomes positive. So the gender gap almost disappears. If you sum these two coefficients, you get something which is almost zero. So before the reform, strong coefficient here, negative coefficient, indicating that financial constraint score is negative for the female, indicating female CEOs have less financial constraint, but after the reform, this disappears. That is for CEO gender gap. If you focus on RFM score and CFO, no significant effect. Why? Because RFM score, the CFO is not interested in it. It's not, the RFM score is perceived by CEO, not CFO. Move to KZ index, and now it's the opposite. It's CFO which matters, because the KZ index is made up of cash, leverage, and dividends and things that are controlled by CFO. So here you can see that female is negative. Okay, so before reform, there is a significant lower KZ index for female, meaning that female faced lower financial constraint before the reform. But after the reform, if you sum these two coefficients, this advantage of females almost disappears or becomes much smaller. So the favorable gender gap in financial constraints faced by the female CEO and CFO reduces a lot after the AC&C. Okay, so this is exactly consistent with our hypothesis. So if you look at before the reform, economically speaking, if you look again at column 1, before the reform, firm with female CEO had a 0.028 lower financial constraint score than firms with male CEO. On average, the RFM score was 0.45, so it means that before reform, female company with female CEO experienced a financial constraint score which was 6.2% lower than average. Quite significant effect. And if you focus on KZ index, before the reform, female firms with female CFO show a KZ index which is 0.218 points lower. And relative to the average of the KZ index, that means that they face a financial constraint index which is almost 14% point lower, which is quite high. So before the reform, there is a significant, economically and statistically significant advantage of female managed companies. They show lower financial constraint score regardless of how you measure the financial constraints here and here. But after the reform, if you sum these two coefficients, you get something which is very small or close to zero. So after the reform, the advantage just disappears, bye-bye. Okay, so consistent with some previous literature, before the AC&C, firms with female managers have lower financial constraint. That's probably due to the political connection. So the advantage disappears after the AC&C, which was characterized by destruction of political connection. So it looks as though if the advantage existed before the AC&C and not after, because the AC&C reform coincided with destruction of political connection, it is very likely that the advantage in financial constraints before the AC&C was indeed due to political connections. So that's in line with our second hypothesis. And in line with our first hypothesis, basically the gender gap in financial constraints for CEO can only be observed with our text-based index, and gender gap in financial constraints for CFO only is observable with the KZ index. Why is that? Because the CFO are responsible for maintaining capital structure and cash and dividends. And so the KZ index is based on capital structure, dividends, cash, and these things, which are controlled by the CFO. So CFO is more sensitive to the KZ index, whereas CEO is responsible for the direction to be given to the company, which is written in the MD&A's text, and the RFM score is based on that text, which is controlled by the CEO. And so that's why the CEO gender gap in financial constraint only appears when we look at the measure of financial constraint, which is the one based on the MND text. And so this is again consistent with our hypothesis 1. So the results are broadly consistent with our hypothesis. However, we need to do a series of robustness tests just to make sure that our results are quite strong. And so we have a few robustness tests and a few extensions. So let me quickly go over it. First, we re-estimate our same model as before, the DID model, on match sample, because it is possible, you could say that the firms managed by female CEO, CFO, you can say, okay, they may be very different if they are managed by female than male CEO or CFO. They may be different in terms of size, for example. Maybe it's the largest firms which are managed by the CEO. They may be more profitable. They're managed by female CFO. If they're more profitable, you could say that these results may be driven by some other characteristic. So we want to do a matched analysis on matched sample. How do we do that? Well, very simple PSM analysis. Just estimate a logit model for, on the left-hand side, you have the female dummy variable, and then as a function of profitability, size, Tobin skew, PPE, year dummies, provincial dummies, and so on. We obtain propensity scores, and then we use one-to-one or one-to-two nearest neighbor matching methods to identify companies that have female CEO, and we identify companies that have male CEO or CFO, which are basically almost identical to the company with female CFO in terms of ROA, size, Tobin skew, PP, and so on. And so once we have the match sample, we have here the companies with female, say, CEO, and here we have companies with male CEO, which are almost identical to the firm with female CEO in terms of ROA, size, Tobin skew, and so on. And so the difference between this group and that group is not going to be size or ROA or Tobin skew. The difference between these two will only be the gender of the CEO. So by doing this matching analysis, we get firms which are led by female and firms that are led by male, which are very similar in terms of all characteristics. And so the only difference between the two groups is the gender of the CEO or the CFO. And then we check whether the mean of firm characteristics such as size and so on are different between firms led by male and female CEO or CFO. We do this before and after the matching. And we can see a huge difference in size and Tobin skew before the matching. But after matching, we see that there is no difference in the means between the treated female managed companies and matched male managed companies. No difference after the matching. And then the difference between the treated and the control group then lies only in the gender of the manager. And then we estimate the model on this match sample. You can see the sample size is much smaller than before because it's matched. So we just use like one match or two matches for each female-led company. So the sample size is much smaller, but the results are the same as before. So for RFM score, female dummy is significant and quite high before AC&C. And after the AC&C, if you sum these two coefficients, the advantage of female becomes almost zero. And then similarly, if you look at KZ index is for CFO is what matters, negative here, so strong advantage of female CFO in terms of financial constraints, KZ index, but after the reform, if you sum these two, the effect is much, much smaller. So estimating the model on match sample is in line with our baseline results. So that's first robustness test. Another one, we kind of control for omitted variable bias. So we add some board female ratio, supervisor female ratio, and manager female ratio. And then we saturate the model with a lot of dummies like industry and provincial dummies. And then we interact provincial and time dummies. And then we interact industry and provincial dummies. And then we interact time and provincial dummies together. And so we add a lot, we saturate the model with a lot of fixed effects, and the results are still robust. And then we do a couple of robustness tests very quickly. So first of all, we expect state-owned companies to be more subject to political connections. So we expect that the effects of the AC&C is stronger for the state-owned companies and also for companies that are based in more corrupt environments. So we divide the sample into two groups by state-owned and not state-owned companies, where state-owned companies are typically more subject to corruption and so likely to be more affected by the AC&C. And then also we look at corrupt environment, and firms operating in more corrupt environments are more likely to suffer more from the AC&C. We use the marketization index to kind of measure the level of corruption of the provinces. And basically a better regional legal environment is associated with less corruption. So the higher the marketization index, the less corrupted the environment will be. And then we estimate the model for firms which live in a corrupt province and firms that do not. So let's look at that first, 5 and 6. Corrupt environment is 5 and non-corrupt environment is 6. And again, here for corrupt environment, we find the same. Female for the CEO, female has an advantage, lower financial constraint score before the reform, and that almost disappears after the reform. And then for CFO, we look at KZ index. And again, we have for corrupt environment, we have like much bigger coefficients compared to the non-corrupt environment. Big advantage here of females before the reform, and that shrinks a lot after the reform. Here it's also significant, but much smaller in size. Okay, and here for corrupt environment is not significant at all. So this suggests that the financial constraints gap before the reform was much higher in corrupt for firms based in provinces with corrupt environment with low marketization index. Okay, and then this advantage disappeared after the reform here for firms that are based in regions with lower marketization index. And if we compare state and non-state, you can see that in all cases, the coefficient associated with state is much higher compared to the coefficients associated with non-state. All the coefficients are much higher in absolute value. And again, this confirms that the female gender gap is there before the reform, and then it disappears after the reform. And then this happens for both the CEO and CFO gender gap. Some effect is also there for non-state companies, but again, the magnitude of the effect is much larger for the state companies in both cases. So this confirms that indeed state-owned companies were more benefit more from the political connections before the reform and then suffered more after the reform. Non-state companies were affected less, and the same firms based in provinces with more corrupt environment were affected more. And then the effect, and then after the reform, the effect tumbled, and this is more evident for firms that were in provinces with low marketization index, which were more subject to the corruption. Okay, and then the last test that we do, we think that political connections are expected to play a more important role for more financially constrained firms. So the more financially constrained you are, the more likely you are to build political connections to lower your financial constraints. So typically financially constrained firms have been shown to have stronger political connections. And so we think that financially constrained firms will have a higher tendency to build the political connection and to be more involved in corruption. So we estimate our model using a panel quantile regression model, and we look at 3 quantile points, 20th, 50th, and 80th quantile. And 80th quantile is firms with highest RFM score or highest KZ score. And we can see that if you have low financial constraint, here there are no effects. But if you have high financial constraint, there is a female gender gap. This is for CEO, female gender gap in financial constraint before the reform, and then the gender gap disappears after the reform. And for KZ index, we have the same thing. The highest coefficients are these ones here for the 80th quantile, significant gender gap in financial constraint before the reform, and that disappears after the reform. So both the gender gap and the effect of the ACSC are more pronounced for more financially constrained firms. And that is what we find here. So that is the results that we have so far. So let me just briefly give some conclusion. So what we do, we investigate whether there exists a gender gap in financial constraints for these Chinese listed firms over the period 2011 to 2020. And we want to see whether the gender gap is affected by the anti-corruption campaign in China. And we build a new measure of text-based measure of financial constraints and use it alongside the traditional KZ index of financial constraints to measure financial constraints as perceived by the CEO and CFO respectively. And we find that firms with female executives were less financially constrained than firms with male executives before the campaign, but this advantage diminished or disappeared after the destruction of political connection resulting from the campaign. And so this suggests that the gender gap in financial constraints observed before the reform was driven by political connection, and that the ACNC was effective in getting rid of these political connections. And in terms of policy implication, there was this gender gap in financial constraints in China, which was likely due to political connection. And then the political connections actually did disappear after the ACNC, which suggests that the ACNC was quite effective in getting rid of political connections. And then we also show that CEO and CFO have inconsistent perceptions of financial constraints. And so that may lead to some bias in the policies that the firms adopt. So in theory, it would be better that the financial constraint perceived by both CNO and CFO is the same, but we find some considerable differences. So in terms of policy implications, firms should try to align the perception of the CEO and CFO in order to improve financial efficiency, in order to make sure that the policies that firms adopt to lower financial constraints, like the two managers propose the same policy, because otherwise there can be some discrepancies, and that's not very good. So policy implication is, it should be good to have an alignment in the perceptions of the financial constraints between the two CEO and the CFO. And so basically, these are the main conclusions that I have. And so this is the panda who keeps eating while I talk. And thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Alessandra, and your co-author for this absolutely exciting paper. Interesting. I can't believe that yeah, you've been presenting for almost 1.5 hours. That was so interesting.
It was so interesting
that it's very rich in every detail. First of all, the idea is very novel. The gap identified in the literature is interesting and fostered in this area. Very solid methodology and absolutely interesting results which offer perception on the gender gap and also the ACCA, the ACC in terms of how it was successful. Now, there are so many interesting things about this paper. There is no doubt from what you presented, so far, although it is still work in progress, there is no doubt that it will end up in a very mainstream journal. The innovation there, a lot of work, testing every aspect, has been accomplished. And maybe what I could do is try just carefully make a couple of kind of observations, especially in some clarity of distinguishing between the anti-corruption campaign ACC and political connections. I think there are many attempts you've done trying to capture, political connection, especially when you allude to whether, the CEO has worked with government. But I was thinking in terms of some work in corporate governance, maybe where the political connection is entrenched by, say, having members, political connected members on the board, or even political members on the board of a company, because it's at the board of the company that policies are set. And so they would be able to do actually more or less direct influence without necessarily having to be corrupt, because it may be they don't have to be. Maybe it's because of the nature of the company that if representation on the board is allowed by political actors or quasi-political actors. The other point is that I found it very interesting of the natural experiment, but I was just trying to think whether it is actually a natural experiment or whether it is in reality a quasi-natural experiment rather than the difference being that in the quasi-experiment, the criteria for assignment is selected by the researcher. When the natural experiment, the assignment occurs naturally without the researcher's intervention and follows a high degree of randomness. But this is maybe kind of semantics trying to distinguish between natural experiment and quasi-natural experiment. I also, I liked very much the way you use a random forest model, getting the work closer to machine learning innovations, basically, and quite innovative. One other observation I'd like to make is about you actually do a great job on the KZ index, based on regression coefficients of the US. You then throw that down, and then you actually do run regressions based on China. So you're trying ever to explore every angle. Then my mind started going very wild. Suppose we know when for those estimated coefficient you are using, we know in reality every estimated coefficient is ranging within the standard error. So it could be plus 0.2 or minus 0.2. We tend to explore that the deviation in, for example, doing stochastic simulations. The stochastic simulation are just based on probabilities, running probabilities that explore the full range of the coefficient plus minus the standard error. Okay. And guess what that would give you is an adjustment that the use of the coefficient you are touching in computing would be within this range. And suppose, for example, that we allowed for the actual coefficient, then plus 2, plus 0.2, or minus 0, depending on the standard error. What you would get then, we would calculate the mean and the standard deviation, and that would give you a true result. This is the nature of that's how wild I was trying to run. Since you kickstarted my brain start working. Oh, one could explore even the kind of deviation in a stochastic way by looking at the, and again, we hope that when then you calculate, you get a more accurate mean and a more accurate standard deviation, maybe. Yeah, absolutely interesting. I like the way the conclusions are made. And I wonder whether there is a way of looking at these results to extract a conclusion about the industrial sector. Would it be no, just to observe that maybe corruption is much more, or the propensity to corruption, the propensity to corruption is much more aligned to some sectors like infrastructure, rather than, say, financial services, or rather than manufacturing, or rather than so these companies are classified according to the industrial classification of these companies. Is it true that some companies, if the data allows you to do that, it tends to show that maybe the ACC did not diminish the level of corruption, maybe, which would say, well, the result would mean that actually corruption is likely to be associated with some certain sectors. It is that it is impervious. It was impervious to the introduction of ACC. Maybe just kind of yeah. Okay. Maybe I should now open the discussion to the floor. I don't see anything in the chat, but I see some hands going up. Brilliant. So the first hand to go up is there is a Hong, there is a Solite Tumine. So I'll go to Hong and then after Solite.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Alessandra. Good to see you. And I really enjoyed it, although I think as a researcher on China, probably I understand why you tackled this issue. And I think econometric econometric is done perfectly with a lot of robustness tests. I have two questions, Alessandra. One is you provided some evidence that is inconsistent with the evidence on this topic in terms of the gender gap in corporate behavior from the standard literature. So Chinese evidence is inconsistent with the standard literature. So you interpreted this in this project. You explained this from the perspective of political connection. So my first question will be, do you think the issue here, or the conclusion, can be applied to the standard literature on gender gap in corporate behavior. For example, do you think, can we apply this to the UK corporate sector? So that's my first question, because you are doing a very big thing now. If that is the case, the whole literature, should be probably reinvestigated, revisited. So that's one thing. Secondly, in terms of the Chinese practice, your empirical analysis is based on the assumption that in China, it is in fact the female directors, i.e. CFO, CEO, is them who are more corrupted, corruption probably is not, who are more politically connected, or who have invested more in political connection. So my second question is, why is that the case? Do you have any evidence? So how to justify this very important assumption? And that's my question. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Should I answer, or should we take the other question first?
If you could bear with me, I take the question from Professor Murinde, because I owe some debt. At the last seminar, I delayed calling upon him, and by the time I did, I think he had already gone to others. So I apologize for missing you at the last meeting. Let me give you the opportunity to say a comment, and then I can ask Alessandra to respond to all the comments here. This is Professor Murinde from Makerere University Business School. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Director, for the opportunity, and thank you so much, Alessandra, for the presentation. He has mentioned my name, the professor, and mine is, I thank you so much for this presentation, which is actually timely. And my understanding was about when I listened to your topic and when I read it again here on the board, I look at the financial constraints, maybe especially in the listed companies in China. I think I'm right. Now, somewhere on slide 28, you mentioned something to do with when you are looking at the Kaizen index, you mentioned that some of the accounting ratios normally take long. And my question was, what did you mean by the use of financial ratios taking long? And when I look at your data, it stems from 2010, 2020. These are about 11 years. And I know as an accounting and finance fellow, every year we publish reports. When we publish reports, and in line with your study, we can be able to compute, for example, the dividend yield, the cost of credit, the cost of capital, especially debt, the cost of equity, depending on whether you're using the return on capital employed, the dividend yield ratio. So when you say they take long and you are having annual reports from 2010, 2020, what do you mean? Yet I know from each of the annual reports, we can extract these ratios. Now, what would be the essence of those extractions and those time series or panel data? One, we would be able to see in each and every year for those female-led companies, what would be, for example, the movement in those accounting ratios? Those which are male-led, what would be the movement in those accounting ratios? For example, the dividend yield, for example, the cost of debt. So that now in your comparative under those statistics we would see a picture of the movement, what they call the trend analysis, the female-led, the male-led, how the financial constraint, when they are managed, this is how they result. But when you say they take long, as an accounting person, I ask myself, wow, how long is long and what does long mean? Yet you are having about from 2010 to 2020. I thought you would give us that trend, and then we see the trend, female-led, male-led. This is the trajectory, and this is how the financial constraints are submerged in the process. Then lastly, the last issue is, there are some silent features you didn't explain. For example, when we say during the ACC, after ACC, What are those causes in between that have caused the movement from the before to the present? There are some silent features we did not explicitly explain. We are looking at the comparative statistics, yes. Before it was, and then after the political kind of, it is this. So how would you explain to a policy maker, to the politicians who could be listening to you, to what do you think would be the cause? If you took, for example, the cause-effect causality, what causes that before? What causes the present? What would be these interventions? And moving forward, what would be your recommendation in line with the political connections and in line with the female or male lane? Should we employ more female as CEOs? Should we employ more female as CFOs? What would be your take on that? If someone asked you, how do you guide in this case as you conclude? What would you tell us as a gathering in that lane? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Slight. Very much appreciate your intervention. Since I don't see any other hand up, maybe I should take this opportunity to ask Alessandra and Don Kiang to, you don't have to respond to all the questions, by the way. Some of them were, suggestions and remarks and observations on where you want to respond to some of the direct questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor, for your very interesting insights, and thanks to Hong and the professor also for other insights. And yeah, I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about the policy implications of this, because we didn't really have time to kind of finish that part of the paper as yet. So yeah, what is the recommendation for policymakers? I think that's something very, very important that we need to think about. But I mean, the main issue that kind of we found is that before the campaign, basically the companies led by females were doing better financially, and after that the advantage decreased. So it was political connections who were favoring the females in a sense, but after the political connections tumbled, then this was no longer the case. Now we have not really thought as to whether this advantage for the females was a good or a bad thing, because if it was a good thing and then it disappeared, then it's not overall, it's not a good conclusion. But if that advantage was not something good from a policy perspective and it disappeared, then the campaign was successful. So we need to think a little bit more about from a policy perspective, what is the right recommendation? We need to think more of that. That's a very helpful comment. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the accounting ratio taking long to adjust, maybe that was not the right wording that I used, but what we meant is that before the campaign, there was this huge advantage of females in terms of showing a lower financial constraint score, and then after the campaign, this advantage decreased, but didn't disappear altogether. So it took some time for it to disappear altogether. So after the campaign, it was still there, but it was smaller, and then it disappeared. So it was not really the accounting ratio which take long to adjust, but maybe the gap in financial constraints which decreased in size and then disappeared afterwards. It took time for it to disappear. So maybe we have to be a little bit more careful with the wording, I think. So yeah, so that in answer to that point. And then regarding Hong's questions, I mean, whether it is the CEO or CFO who are politically connected or not. Well, I mean, that we look at the gender gap in terms of firms which are managed by female or male CEO and CFO, but we don't really look at whether it is these guys who are politically connected. In fact, all we notice is that this advantage disappeared after the ACNC, so we deduce that political connection was a reason for this, but we didn't really look at who is politically connected and whether they are politically connected or not. We just look at, we take into advantage the before and after the reform to draw conclusions on political connections. So we don't really know who is connected and who is not from that point of view. And then, yeah, in terms of the literature, the standard literature, about how our conclusions can be applied to the standard literature. Well, the problem is there is very few literature which has looked at the gender gap in financial constraints. There is no literature, in fact. There's just this Chinese Sun and Zhu, which found that there is no gap, but this is not their paper. Their paper is about profitability. They just have like a further test or something in a footnote. I mean, they don't really analyze financial constraints as their main selling point. I mean, they do that as just as an additional remark or additional test, but they say that there is no financial constraint in China. So basically, whether there is a huge literature that looked at whether female-led companies, females with more diverse boards, they perform better, they have more green innovation or things like that, or innovation in general, but not, to our knowledge, financial constraints have not really been looked at in this case. And so so we don't really answer to that now, because there is no literature, basically. Now, looking at what Victor asked, looking at the importance of the board, because it's the board which sets the policy, I think that's like a very important point. So we may want to have some further tests about that, because we do have data on the boards and whether like the diversity in the boards and stuff like that. So we may want to have some further tests looking at that. And difference between natural experiment and the quasi-natural experiment, yeah, that I have to think a little bit more, because I was not very sure about the difference, so we need to look into that a little bit more. And then, yeah, doing the stochastic simulation, that would be quite cool thing to do, because then that KZ index that we have is a bit dull, but if we did that, it would become much more interesting and accurate. So I think that's a very good suggestion, and thank you very much for that. And then looking at industrial sector also, I think that it's something, I think we have data on industrial sector, so I think it would be very interesting to look at that later. As I said, this is not a finished product, so we can still add many things, and that is the beauty of receiving feedback from such experienced people like in this setting, and I really love that. So I take a note of this, and we'll look into that later. And then, yeah, I think these were the main points. I'm not sure if Dongjuan wants to add anything. Maybe not.
Yeah. Yes. No, that's good, I think.
Okay.
Maybe a minute. I want to add a very quick one to the presenters. You know, papers of this kind, we are more concerned or interested in what we call policy implication, and then academic, actually scholarly implication. Because one would want to know what model ushered you into this work, for example, or the theoretical model, so that by the end of your presentation, we want to see what is your contribution to the scholarly work. Then policy-wise, like what I asked previously, policy makers in China listening to you now, world over, I am in Africa, in Uganda, I want to see what does this contestation mean if I'm in Uganda, and tomorrow, and CEOs are listening in, what are we telling them? Employ more of what? Policy, scholarly. We need to have more focus, more stand on those issues, so that we move the world. Those are a few of my issues you have to think about as well. Thank you.
That is very good points, yeah, especially for the policy implications, like not only for China, but also for other countries that have these problems. Like corruption is a big issue also in Italy, and so if we could expand this outside the Chinese context, that we need to work a bit more on that. I think these are excellent suggestions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting work, and the technical elements of the work is fantastic, and I think polishing them and extracting the key messages will be absolutely helpful. Do political connections matter? maybe if you are looking at the political connection of all of the COO, in case there is a example where all the CEOs are politically connected. In other words, you have to be connected to the government to get a position of a CEO. That would be like an extreme case. And then you have so it would also be interesting to see to what extent, in China, that's out of a random sample, so many farms or even the farms who what is the nature of political connections. Yeah, there are reasons why this work is really. But the interesting bit is that slide where you actually knocked down, explained carefully the impact of the anti-corruption campaign. To me, that was amazing. And I think it should sell this paper, very strongly to see that, there was a dramatic impact, over the years, and therefore the basis for this story. Yeah, great work. And let me see. There are already there is a long list of people waiting for this paper. So let me assure the people in the audience that once Alessandra and Don Quing have revised the paper, they will give you, share with you a copy for further comments on the revised version on the web submission. But there is a hand. I saw a hand going up. Yes, Rofire Maleka. Good to see you again. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Good to see you too. Thank you, sir. Just a quick one. Apologies if I may have missed this at the start of the presentation. What actually triggered the anti-corruption campaign in China? I'm asking, it's just interesting times being South African for those who may have come across some articles relating to our country. And there's always been an argument that a leader cannot really correct themselves, if that makes sense. So what do you know what triggered the anti-corruption campaign in China and how it was actually enacted? I think based on what one of the professors asked earlier, what does this mean for policy, for people in leadership who might come across your paper? Which audience would actually have justification for action, and yeah, how would they go about it, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe Dong Xuan, you can answer that.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, for the backgrounds about the anti-corruption campaign, the main reason is because the change of the president in the 2012, and well, the main targets for the anti-corruptions is like because they need to satisfy to the citizens, their willingness to the citizens, because before the 2012, actually there are many others anti-corruption campaign, but this is not a very big one, just some small campaigns. But after the transitions of the presidents, so he need to make more work or to earn some maybe to satisfy the willingness for the citizens. So that is the main reasons for the. So about the implications or the policies implications or the contributions on the policies, I think yes, it is a very great questions. Yes, we need to think more about this because yes, because this is something relevant with whether this campaign is endogenous or exogenous, which may affect our result. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Refile. And let me go back and thank once again, Alessandra. Absolutely interesting paper, as usual, and also Don Quing for this great work that you are doing with the Alessandra. And let me thank all of you here for being with us at this seminar. And I look forward to seeing you next week, same time, as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you very much for all the comments, as well, very
you.
interesting
Thank you.
comments.
Thank
So
you.
thank you for everything. Yeah, thank you.